Richard Harlow was the embodiment of success in Los Angeles. His name commanded respect in the city's thriving construction industry, his company building the skylines that shaped the future. Yet behind the polished exterior, he was a man haunted by the shadows of his past. Those who interacted with him spoke of his cold, detached demeanor, but few knew the real reason behind his solitude. He had spent years burying his emotions beneath layers of concrete and steel, his heart as fortified as the towering buildings he designed. As a young man, Richard had been idealistic and full of dreams, but something had happened, something that changed him forever. A love lost, a life abandoned, but the details were never shared. Richard had shut the door on his personal life, locking away any connection to those painful memories. Now, he was in his early 50s, a man consumed by his work, driven by an insatiable hunger for success. Yet with every project he completed, every skyscraper he erected, there was an ever-present emptiness that gnawed at him. No one knew about the personal failures that haunted him, failures he refused to acknowledge, even to himself. The world saw a man who had everything, but Richard saw a man with nothing. Another late night, Mr. Harlow, his assistant, Claire, asked one evening as she stepped into his dimly lit office. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling city below, twinkling with life. Richard barely looked up from the blueprints scattered across his desk. "Work doesn't stop because the sun goes down," he muttered, his voice as gruff as always. Claire hesitated at the door, watching him for a moment longer. "It's been like this for weeks. You should." "I should what, Claire?" he snapped, finally looking up, his piercing eyes silencing her immediately. "Go home, take a vacation, relax." His words were laced with sarcasm. He stood up, walking toward the window, staring out at the vast city. "Relaxation is for people who can afford to waste time." Claire opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. She knew better than to argue with him when he was in one of these moods. She had worked for him long enough to recognize the signs. Something was troubling him. But what? She left the office quietly, leaving him to his brooding thoughts. Richard watched the city for a while longer, but his mind was elsewhere. Los Angeles, with all its glamour and success, only served as a distraction from the gnawing void in his chest. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, the memory of a woman, her face, her smile, flashed in his mind. He shook it off, angry at himself for allowing it to resurface. It had been years since he had let himself think about her. He couldn't afford distractions. Not now. But despite his best efforts, something had shifted. Restlessness had taken hold of him, and he found himself questioning the choices that had led him to this moment. As he sat back down at his desk, the silence of his office echoed the silence in his heart. Alone. Successful, but deeply, irrevocably alone. This was Richard Harlow, an empire built on steel, but a soul trapped in ruins. The rain had come unexpectedly that night, drenching the streets of Los Angeles. Richard's black Mercedes slid smoothly through the slick roads, his mind as foggy as the mist hanging over the city. He drove without a destination, his thoughts far from the present. The usual drive home to his empty mansion felt unbearable tonight. Something gnawed at him, something he couldn't place, a restlessness that had been building for days. He turned into a less familiar part of the city, far from his usual routes. The sleek, modern buildings gave way to dilapidated homes and cracked sidewalks, the kind of neighborhood Richard would normally never set foot in. Yet tonight, it didn't matter. He felt drawn here, though he couldn't explain why. As he slowed at an intersection, the dim glow of a streetlight caught his attention. Underneath it stood a boy, no older than 12, huddled in a ragged hoodie, his face streaked with dirt. He was kneeling next to a woman who was slumped against the wall, her frail figure barely visible under a torn blanket. The boy's hands trembled as he touched her shoulder, his voice just barely audible through the rolled-down window. "Mom, Mom, you need to wake up," he whispered, desperation choking his words. Something inside Richard twisted at the sight. He wasn't a man easily moved by such scenes. After all, this city was full of the desperate and downtrodden. He had long learned to ignore them. But this boy, there was something different about him. His eyes, wide with fear, were filled with a determination far beyond his years. The boy reminded Richard of someone, himself, perhaps as a child, or someone he had known a lifetime ago. Richard pulled his car to the side of the road, the wipers still thudding rhythmically against the windshield. For a moment, he considered driving away. He wasn't one to get involved in the problems of strangers, but the boy's voice, fragile yet firm, kept echoing in his mind. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain, his leather shoes splashing in the puddles. The boy looked up, startled, as Richard approached. He stood protectively in front of the woman, his small frame tense, ready to defend her despite the hopelessness of the situation. "What do you want?" the boy asked, his voice cracking as he tried to sound tough. His eyes betrayed him. He was scared. Richard stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his gaze shifting from the boy to the woman. She was unconscious, her face pale, her breathing shallow. There was no question. She needed medical help. "Your mother," Richard began, his voice calm but firm. "She needs to get to a hospital." The boy shook his head violently. No hospitals. We don't have any money, and they'll take her away from me." His voice broke, and for the first time, Richard saw just how vulnerable he was. Richard knelt down slowly, making sure not to alarm the boy further. "Look, I can help," he said, locking eyes with him. "She won't make it if you don't let me help. Do you want her to die out here?" The boy's lip trembled, but he didn't back down. "I can take care of her. I just need to get her warm, that's all." Richard sighed, glancing again at the woman. Her face stirred a memory deep within him, but he couldn't place it. He looked back at the boy. "What's your name?" "Michael," the boy replied reluctantly. "Michael," Richard said, his tone softening. "I know you're trying to protect her, but she's very sick. I'll get her to a hospital, and I'll make sure they don't take her away. You have my word." Michael hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if trying to judge Richard's sincerity. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, a sharp edge of suspicion in his voice. For a moment, Richard didn't have an answer. He was a stranger, a man in a suit with no real reason to care. And yet, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he did care. He saw something in this boy's determination that stirred something long buried inside him. "Because I've been where you are," Richard finally said, the words surprising even himself. "And I know what it's like to lose someone." The boy stared at him, his tough exterior faltering just a little. Richard could see the fight draining out of him. Slowly, Michael nodded. Richard wasted no time. He scooped the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised by how light she was. She barely stirred as he carried her to the car, Michael trailing close behind. As they settled her into the back seat, Richard saw Michael's hand grasping his mother's. The boy was still scared, but he was trying to be brave. "What's her name?" Richard asked as he started the engine. "Sarah," Michael whispered, his voice filled with worry. Richard's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his heart skipping a beat. Sarah. The name echoed in his mind, stirring old, forgotten memories. He hadn't known many Sarahs in his life, just one. But it couldn't be, could it? He shook the thought away, focusing on the road ahead. This was just a coincidence. There was no reason to think that the woman passed out in his back seat was that Sarah. Still, a nagging sense of unease settled over him as they sped through the rainy streets, the past creeping closer with every mile. The car ride to the hospital was heavy with silence. Michael sat in the back seat, holding his mother's limp hand, his eyes darting nervously between her pale face and the passing lights outside the window. Richard could feel the tension thick in the air, and for once, he found himself unsure of what to say. He'd always been a man who could handle any situation with ease. Boardroom battles, negotiations, construction deals. But now, sitting behind the wheel with a sick woman in the back seat and a terrified boy next to her, Richard felt strangely out of his depth. He glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his mind racing with questions. As they pulled up to the hospital entrance, Richard cut the engine and turned to Michael. "Stay with your mother. I'll take care of everything," he said, his voice low but commanding. Michael didn't respond, but the look in his eyes was clear. He didn't trust this situation, not completely. He was still on edge. Richard hurried into the emergency room, explaining the situation to the receptionist. Within minutes, nurses were rushing outside with a stretcher. They gently lifted Sarah from the back seat, her body limp and unresponsive. Michael refused to let go of her hand, walking alongside the nurses as they wheeled her into the hospital. Richard followed them through the automatic doors, his mind racing. There was something about the name Sarah that had set him on edge during the drive, a discomfort he couldn't quite shake. It gnawed at him like a splinter lodged in his thoughts. Inside, they were met by a doctor who immediately began examining Sarah. Richard stood back, watching the scene unfold from a distance. Michael hovered close to his mother's side, his small frame looking even smaller next to the hospital bed. The boy's eyes were glued to his mother's pale face, the fear in them undeniable. After a few tense minutes, the doctor approached Richard and Michael. "She's dehydrated, malnourished, and running a high fever. We're running some tests, but it looks like a severe case of pneumonia. We'll need to admit her for at least a few days to stabilize her condition," the doctor explained, his tone clinical but kind. Michael's face fell. "A few days?" he asked, his voice shaky. "But what about me? I can't leave her alone." Richard stepped forward, his voice calm. "She won't be alone, Michael. They'll take care of her here." He glanced at the doctor. "Do whatever needs to be done. I'll handle the costs." The doctor nodded, clearly accustomed to people like Richard, men who solved problems by throwing money at them. He didn't question it and simply moved on. But Michael, standing next to his mother's bed, wasn't convinced. "What happens to me?" he asked, his voice trembling now. "I can't stay here. They won't let me." Richard stared at the boy for a moment, his mind racing for a solution. He wasn't prepared for this, for taking responsibility of a child he didn't even know. But before he could come up with an answer, Michael spoke again. "I don't have anyone else," the boy muttered, barely above a whisper. "It's just me and her." Richard felt a familiar pang of empathy, a sensation he had long tried to suppress. His mind flashed back to a younger version of himself, alone in a sterile hospital waiting room, waiting for news about his father. No one had been there for him. No one had cared. He remembered the loneliness, the helplessness. And here, standing in front of him, was another boy facing the same fear. "Come with me," Richard said suddenly, surprising himself. "You can stay with me until your mother is better." Michael's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and suspicion crossing his face. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his tone sharp. He wasn't used to strangers offering help, especially not wealthy men in expensive suits driving luxury cars. Richard paused for a moment, considering the question. Why was he doing this? He didn't know this boy or his mother, and he certainly wasn't in the habit of taking in strangers off the street. But something about Michael, something in his defiance and vulnerability, stirred something deep inside him. Maybe it was guilt. Guilt for his own failures, for the people he had lost, for the people he had pushed away. "I don't know," Richard admitted, "but you need help, and your mother needs time to recover. I can give you a place to stay, at least until she's well enough to leave the hospital." Michael looked unsure, his brow furrowing as he considered Richard's offer. "But what if something happens to her while I'm gone? I can't just leave her." Richard knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. "I'll make sure you can see her every day. I'll take you here myself, and you can check on her. But right now, you need a place to sleep and food to eat. And your mother needs you to be strong for her." The boy looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Finally, with a reluctant nod, Michael agreed. "Okay, but just until she gets better," he said quietly. Richard stood up, nodding. "Just until she gets better." They left the hospital under the cover of night, the rain still tapping lightly against the car windows. The drive to Richard's home was quiet, the weight of the evening pressing down on both of them. As they pulled into the driveway of Richard's sprawling estate, Michael's eyes widened slightly, though he tried to hide his awe. "This is where you live?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "For now," Richard replied, opening the door and leading the boy inside. The house was vast and cold, all polished marble floors and high ceilings. It was a stark contrast to the warmth Michael had tried so desperately to create for his mother on the streets. He looked uncomfortable, out of place. Richard led him to a guest room, the size of which was probably larger than the entire apartment Michael had shared with his mother. "You can sleep here tonight. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." Michael nodded, but the look in his eyes said he wasn't hungry. He was still wary, still unsure of why this stranger was helping him. He stood at the door, shifting from one foot to the other. "Why are you doing this?" Michael asked again, quieter this time. There was no edge to his voice, just genuine confusion. Richard met his gaze, but for once, he didn't have a ready answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know why he had pulled over that night, why he had offered to help, or why he couldn't stop thinking about the name Sarah. "Get some rest," Richard finally said. "We'll visit your mother in the morning." Michael hesitated a moment longer, then nodded and stepped inside the room, closing the door softly behind him. As Richard stood alone in the hallway, his mind drifted back to the woman in the hospital bed. That name, Sarah, still lingered in his thoughts like a ghost from a life he had tried so hard to forget. But was it her? Could it really be the same woman he had lost all those years ago? The questions burned in his mind as he made his way down the darkened hallway. He needed answers, and something told him that this boy and his mother were going to be the key to unlocking a past he had buried long ago. The sun filtered weakly through the blinds the next morning, casting pale light over Richard's spacious kitchen. He sat at the marble counter, sipping his coffee, but his mind wasn't on the dark liquid in front of him. Michael was still asleep in the guest room, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet for Richard's liking. His thoughts had been restless all night, circling back again and again to the woman in the hospital. Sarah. The name had echoed in his mind ever since Michael had first said it. It couldn't be the same woman. It was impossible, right? He hadn't seen her in over a decade. Not since she'd left him without a word, leaving his life in ruins. He had searched for her for months back then, desperate to understand why she had disappeared. But she was gone, vanished, as if she had never existed. He shook his head, trying to clear the memories that kept creeping back. Richard wasn't a man who lived in the past. He had built his entire life on moving forward, never looking back. But now, with Michael and this woman, this Sarah, something about it felt too close, too real to ignore. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen. For a moment, he considered calling the hospital to check on her condition. But he knew that wasn't why he was doing this. He needed answers. Who was this woman, and why did she carry the name of the person who had once meant everything to him? Instead of calling the hospital, he dialed a different number. An old contact, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Harlow," the voice said with a note of surprise. "Didn't expect to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "Tony," Richard replied, leaning back in his chair, trying to sound casual. "I need a favor." Discreet. Tony chuckled on the other end. "Aren't they all? What is it this time?" "There's a woman at the hospital. I need you to run a background check. Name's Sarah. She was admitted last night, pneumonia. Came in with a kid named Michael. See what you can dig up." There was a pause. Tony wasn't one to ask questions, but Richard could sense his curiosity. "That's all? Just a name and a hospital?" "For now," Richard said, his tone sharp enough to close the topic. "All right. I'll get back to you soon." Richard hung up and tossed the phone onto the counter, staring down at his half-empty coffee cup. He knew he was digging into something he might regret, but after all these years, the urge to know had become too strong. Who was this Sarah? Was it truly her? Just then, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. Michael appeared in the doorway, his hair messy and his eyes still groggy from sleep. He paused, looking uncertain for a moment before quietly entering the kitchen. Richard noticed the way the boy glanced around, still trying to make sense of this strange new environment. "I made breakfast," Richard said, motioning toward the plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table. "You hungry?" Michael nodded slowly, taking a seat at the table, though he seemed uncomfortable. As he picked at his food, Richard observed him in silence. The boy was quiet, reserved, but there was something resilient about him, something that reminded Richard of himself at that age, guarded, wary of letting anyone in. "How's your mom?" Richard asked carefully, breaking the silence. Michael looked up, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "The doctor said she's still really sick. They said she's not going to be able to leave for a few days at least." Richard nodded. "We'll visit her later today. You'll be able to check in on her, okay?" Michael gave a small nod, but he seemed distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. After a few minutes, he finally spoke up, his voice quiet. "Why are you helping us?" Richard paused, the question catching him off guard. It was the second time Michael had asked, but this time it felt heavier, more loaded. Richard could see the boy's confusion, the uncertainty in his eyes. "I told you," Richard said slowly. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel alone, to not know who to trust." Michael stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "You didn't have anyone either?" Richard exhaled, leaning back against the counter. "Not for a long time, no." The boy fell silent again, seemingly deep in thought. Richard could sense that he wanted to ask more, but he wasn't ready to open up yet. That was fine. Richard wasn't ready to share much either. Later that morning, they drove back to the hospital. Richard parked the car and led Michael inside, the familiar sterility of the building greeting them with its cold air. Michael's pace quickened as they approached the room where his mother was staying. As they entered, they saw her lying in bed, still pale and frail, but her breathing had steadied. She was hooked up to N4, and the nurse had left a small tray of food next to her bed. Michael rushed to her side, grasping her hand tightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but then she saw Michael, and a weak smile tugged at her lips. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard stood in the doorway, watching the interaction from a distance. Something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at Michael, tugged at a memory deep inside him. But it wasn't until Sarah's eyes lifted, meeting his, that Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Her gaze froze on him, confusion washing over her face. And then, recognition. "Richard," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her eyes widened, her face paling even more than before. It felt like the world tilted for a moment, the hospital room suddenly shrinking as the past came crashing into the present. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard her say his name in over a decade, and now, here she was, alive, in front of him. "Sarah?" His voice was barely audible, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else. Guilt. Maybe. Michael looked between them, confused and alarmed by the sudden tension in the room. You know each other?" the boy asked, his voice shaking slightly. Neither of them answered right away. Richard's mind was spinning, piecing together fragments of a story he hadn't even realized he was part of. His eyes flickered to Michael, then back to Sarah, the realization hitting him like a blow to the chest. This boy. It couldn't be. But the look in Sarah's eyes said it all. "Mom?" Michael asked again, his voice trembling now, desperate for answers. Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to speak. But before she could say anything, the door opened, and the nurse stepped in, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Harlow, Michael, I'm sorry, but we need to run some more tests on your mother," she said, giving them a polite but firm nod. Richard didn't say anything as the nurse began prepping Sarah for more exams. He just stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to leave the room, but not before catching one last look from Sarah, a look filled with regret and unspoken truths. As the door closed behind him, Richard leaned against the cold wall of the hospital hallway, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. There was no denying it now. Michael was his son. The hallway outside Sarah's hospital room felt cold and sterile, but Richard couldn't move. His mind was reeling, his breath shallow as he replayed the moment in his head. Sarah's shocked expression, the name slipping from her lips, and the unmistakable realization that the boy inside that room was his son. He leaned heavily against the wall, his pulse pounding in his ears. How had this happened? His world, built so carefully over the years, was crumbling before his eyes. He had spent so long convincing himself that Sarah was gone forever, that whatever they had was a part of the past. Yet here she was, and worse, she had kept something from him. Someone? Michael, his son. Richard's fists clenched involuntarily. Why hadn't she told him? How could she have kept something so monumental from him all these years? The door to the hospital room opened, and Michael stepped out, his expression full of confusion. He stopped when he saw Richard standing there, the tension in the air between them palpable. The boy was still trying to piece together what had just happened in the room, but Richard could see the questions brewing in his eyes. "Do you really know my mom?" Michael asked, his voice tentative. He was trying to act tough, but the uncertainty in his voice gave him away. Richard swallowed hard, searching for the right words. Yes, he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. A long time ago. Michael's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping in. But you never said anything. Why didn't she say anything? What's going on? Richard opened his mouth to respond but stopped. How could he explain it? How could he tell this boy that his entire life had been built on a lie, that his mother had kept the truth from both of them? He wasn't even sure if he wanted to have that conversation, if he was ready for it. "Let's go for a walk," Richard said finally, motioning toward the elevator. "We can talk and I'll answer what I can." Michael hesitated, but then nodded, curiosity and frustration warring in his expression. Together, they walked silently through the sterile halls of the hospital, neither of them speaking until they reached the small courtyard outside. The air was crisp, and the quiet sounds of the city filtered in through the hospital walls. Richard felt the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold settle heavily on his shoulders. They sat down on a bench, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. Richard could feel Michael's eyes on him, waiting, but he needed a moment to gather his thoughts. "Your mother and I," Richard began slowly, his voice low. "We knew each other a long time ago. We were close, very close." Michael stared at him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. "We were together, before you were born. But something happened, and she left. She disappeared. I didn't know why, and I didn't know where she had gone." He paused, searching Michael's face for any signs of understanding. "I didn't know about you." Michael's eyes widened, realization dawning on him, but it came with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You mean, you're saying you're my dad?" His voice was sharp, defensive, as though the idea was too much for him to process. Richard nodded, his heart heavy. "Yes, I think I am." For a moment, the boy sat there in stunned silence, his eyes darting away as if trying to make sense of it all. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench, and Richard could see the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Confusion, betrayal, anger. It mirrored everything Richard had been feeling since that moment in the hospital room. "But why didn't she tell me?" Michael demanded, his voice rising. "Why didn't she tell you? Why did she keep me from you all these years?" Richard wished he had an answer, but he didn't. "I don't know," he said honestly, his voice tight. "I've been asking myself the same thing." The boy jumped up, pacing back and forth in front of Richard, his hands shaking with frustration. "This doesn't make any sense," Michael yelled, his voice cracking. All this time, I thought it was just me and her. I thought I didn't have anyone else. Why would she do this?" Richard stood up, reaching out as if to steady the boy, but Michael flinched away. "Look, I don't know why she left or why she kept this from both of us, but I'm going to find out. I promise you that." Michael stopped pacing, his chest heaving as he tried to rein in his emotions. "What if she didn't want you to find out?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with fear. "What if she had a reason?" Richard didn't have an answer for that either. There were 100 different scenarios running through his mind. Why Sarah had left, why she hadn't told him about their son. But none of them felt right. None of them made sense. "Whatever her reasons were," Richard said, his voice firm now, "it doesn't change the fact that you deserve to know the truth. And I deserve to know, too." The boy looked up at him, his face a mixture of uncertainty and longing. Richard could see how much Michael wanted answers, how desperately he needed to make sense of his world, and how afraid he was of what those answers might be. "I'll find out why," Richard said, meeting Michael's gaze. "But right now, your mom needs to get better. We'll talk to her when she's strong enough, and we'll get the truth." Michael nodded, but the anger and confusion were still simmering just beneath the surface. Richard knew this was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. He wasn't sure what he would find when he finally got the truth out of Sarah, but he knew it wouldn't be simple. Nothing about this was. Later that afternoon, they returned to the hospital, but Sarah was still undergoing tests. Richard stood at the window of her room, watching as the doctors and nurses moved around her, adjusting IVs and checking monitors. He felt a surge of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: grief, anger, and something close to fear. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Tony. "Got some information for you." Tony's voice came through the phone, low and serious. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Richard's gut twisted. "What did you find?" "Sarah Green. She's been living under the radar for years. No employment history for a while, just a string of addresses. Moved around a lot. But here's the kicker. She's been using an alias. Different names, different cities. Looks like she was running from something or someone." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. Running from who? There was a long pause on the other end. "I don't know. But there's one more thing you need to know. About the kid." Richard braced himself. "What is it?" "The birth certificate lists you as the father." "Richard," Tony said, his voice hard. "She knew. She always knew." Richard's world tilted. He stood there, gripping the phone, the revelation crashing over him like a wave. Sarah had known all along. She had kept this secret from him, from their son, for years. And now, with everything out in the open, there was no going back. He ended the call, staring through the hospital window at Sarah, her chest rising and falling slowly with each breath. The woman who had meant everything to him once. The woman who had lied to him. But why? And who had she been running from? Richard stood frozen in the hospital hallway, Tony's words echoing in his mind. She always knew. Sarah had deliberately kept Michael from him all these years. His name, listed on the birth certificate, proof that she had hidden the truth from him. His fists clenched tightly as the weight of betrayal settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had spent years burying the pain of losing her, convincing himself that whatever had happened between them was in the past. But now, standing here with the knowledge that Sarah had stolen years of his son's life from him, that old wound ripped wide open. The hospital seemed to blur around him as a flood of memories surged forward. Sarah's smile, the warmth of her touch, and the life they had almost built together. He had loved her more than anything, and she had disappeared without a trace, leaving him in the dark. But worse than her leaving was the lie she had lived, the son he had been denied. He could barely process it. As he stood there, struggling to control the anger burning inside him, the door to Sarah's room creaked open, and a nurse stepped out, giving him a nod. "You can see her now, Mr. Harlow. She's stable enough for visitors." Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront her, but the time for avoidance had passed. He took a deep breath and walked into the room, the sterile scent of the hospital mixing with the sound of the heart monitor's steady beeps. Sarah was lying in the bed, her face pale, her breathing still shallow. She turned her head weakly as he entered, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. "Richard." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, filled with fatigue and something else, fear. She knew what was coming. He stood at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, staring at her with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You knew," he said, his voice low but hard. "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" Sarah blinked, her eyes welling with emotion, but she didn't deny it. She began, but her voice faltered, and she looked away, her guilt written all over her face. Richard stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Why, Sarah?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why would you keep something like this from me? Why didn't you tell me about Michael?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she swallowed them down, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was protecting him," she whispered, her gaze still avoiding his. I did what I thought I had to do. Protecting him from what? From me? Richard's voice was filled with bitterness. The idea that she had run to protect their son from him felt like a knife to the heart. He had never wanted anything more than to have a family, to be the kind of father his own had never been. Sarah shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. No, not from you, Richard. It wasn't about you. She took a shaky breath, finally meeting his gaze. It was about him. Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. Who? Who were you running from? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say what she had kept hidden for so long. After I left, things got complicated. There were people, dangerous people, and I couldn't risk them finding out about Michael. I didn't know who to trust, and I had to keep him safe. Richard stared at her, the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but now mixed with a growing sense of dread. Who are you talking about, Sarah? What kind of people? She opened her eyes, and the fear in them was unmistakable. Alejandro, my ex-husband. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The pieces started falling into place. Michael had mentioned an uncle, but there had been no mention of a father figure. He had assumed Sarah had raised Michael alone, but now, a much darker picture was emerging. He was dangerous, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. I got involved with him after I left you, when I didn't know what else to do. He was charming at first, but then things changed. He was controlling, violent, and when I found out I was pregnant with Michael, I knew I couldn't let him near my child. So I ran. Richard's stomach turned. He felt a wave of anger and guilt. Anger at this man he had never known existed, and guilt for not knowing what Sarah had been through. He had been angry with her for so long, convinced she had simply abandoned him, but now he was faced with the reality that she had been running for her life, for their son's life. Why didn't you tell me? Richard asked, his voice quieter now, filled with hurt. I could have helped. I could have protected both of you. Sarah's eyes filled with regret. I didn't know how to tell you, Richard. I was scared, and by the time I realized how much danger we were in, it was too late. I thought if I stayed hidden, if I kept moving, Alejandro would never find us. I didn't want to drag you into it. I thought I was doing the right thing. Richard let out a slow breath, his mind racing with everything she had just revealed. It didn't erase the years of anger or the pain of being kept in the dark, but it added a new layer to the story, one he hadn't anticipated. He sat down heavily in the chair next to her bed, rubbing his hands over his face. So, what now? He asked, his voice quieter, calmer, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. Is he still looking for you? Sarah shook her head weakly. I don't know. It's been years since I've heard anything, but I can't be sure. That's why I kept moving, why I didn't stay in one place too long. I didn't want to risk it. Richard stared at her for a long moment, processing everything she had said. His anger hadn't faded, but now it was mixed with something else. Fear for Michael's safety. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about their son. You should have told me, Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. You should have given me a choice. He's my son too. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, her face crumpling as she whispered, I'm sorry, Richard. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was doing what was best for him. Richard shook his head, his heart aching with the weight of lost time. We can't go back and change what happened, he said, his voice firm but filled with sadness. But we have to figure out how to move forward. For Michael. Sarah nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I know, and I'll tell him when I'm stronger. He deserves to know everything. Richard stood up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. I'll give you time to heal, Sarah, he said softly, but we're going to have to tell him soon. He's already asking questions. As he walked to the door, he paused and looked back at her. The woman he had loved so deeply, the woman who had disappeared and shattered his world, was still there, broken and fragile, but alive. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. His life and Michael's life would never be the same again. Richard drove in silence, the weight of the revelations from Sarah pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The road stretched out ahead, but his mind was stuck on what had just unfolded at the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the city blurred by. The confrontation with Sarah had left him rattled, years of unresolved emotions bubbling to the surface all at once. He wasn't sure what he felt anymore. Anger? Sadness? A strange sense of relief? Perhaps all of it, tangled in a knot too tight to untie. Beside him, Michael sat quietly, staring out the window. The boy hadn't said much since they left the hospital, and Richard couldn't blame him. The truth of their connection had been hanging between them, unspoken but heavy. Michael was smart. He must have sensed it by now. As they approached Richard's estate, the sprawling mansion came into view, standing imposingly against the backdrop of the hills. It had always felt like a fortress to Richard, a place to hide from the world while keeping himself detached. But now, with Michael next to him, the house felt more hollow than ever. They pulled into the driveway, and Michael finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Is my mom going to be okay?" Richard turned off the engine and looked at the boy. There was fear in Michael's eyes, fear that mirrored his own. "She's going to need time," Richard said softly, "but the doctors are doing everything they can. She's strong, Michael. She'll get through this." Michael nodded, but the uncertainty remained. Richard could see the exhaustion etched in the boy's face, the strain of trying to understand everything, the fear of losing the only parent he had ever known. It was too much for a child to bear, and Richard hated that he had been absent for so long, that Michael had been carrying this burden alone. They stepped inside the house, the grand foyer echoing with their footsteps. Michael looked around, still clearly uncomfortable in the unfamiliar surroundings. Richard noticed the way he kept his distance, never venturing too far from the door, as if ready to flee at any moment. He was still holding himself back, unsure if he could trust Richard, unsure if this place could ever feel like home. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked, trying to break the awkward silence. "I can make you something to eat." Michael shook his head, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "I'm not hungry." Richard stood there for a moment, feeling helpless. He wasn't used to this. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. He had spent his entire life immersed in business, dealing with numbers and blueprints, not children, not emotions. But Michael was his son, and despite the anger and confusion, Richard knew he had to try. "Do you want to go see your room?" Richard asked gently. "I set it up for you. You don't have to stay there if you don't want to, but it's yours." Michael hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." Richard led him down the long hallway to a room that had been hastily prepared. It wasn't much yet, just a simple bed, a desk, and a few books on the shelves. He had tried to make it feel welcoming, but the space still felt cold, impersonal, lacking the warmth a child's room should have. As they stepped inside, Michael glanced around, his expression unreadable. "You can add anything you want," Richard said, feeling the need to fill the silence. "If there's something you like, anything at all, we can get it." Michael walked over to the window, looking out at the vast garden beyond. The room, like the rest of the house, was large, too large for a boy who had lived his life in cramped apartments and run-down neighborhoods. It felt like a strange dream, and Michael didn't seem to know how to process it. "Thanks," Michael said quietly, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. Richard could sense the boy's discomfort, the way he seemed so out of place in this world. The gap between them was wider than he had expected. But how could it not be? They were strangers. Blood connected them, but there was a lifetime of distance to overcome. "I'm going to leave you alone for a bit," Richard said, realizing that pushing the boy would only make things harder. "If you need anything, just let me know." Michael didn't say anything, but Richard could see the relief in his body language. The boy wanted space, and Richard, still overwhelmed himself, needed it too. As Richard left the room and closed the door softly behind him, he paused in the hallway, leaning back against the wall. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the comforting solitude he had grown used to. Now, the silence felt wrong, heavy with the unspoken truths between him and his son. For years, he had imagined what it would be like to have a child, but this wasn't how he thought it would happen. He had missed Michael's entire childhood. His first steps, his first words, his birthdays, and all the little moments that shaped a boy into the person standing in that room. How could he possibly make up for all that lost time? Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened across the house, Richard found himself sitting in his study, staring out the window at the darkening sky. His phone buzzed on the desk next to him, but he ignored it. His thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the events of the day. He had spent years building walls around himself, convinced that his work, his success, was all that mattered. But now, with Michael here, with Sarah's truth unraveling, those walls felt flimsy. The fortress he had built to keep the world out was starting to crack. There was a knock at the door. Richard turned, surprised to see Michael standing there, hovering in the doorway, looking unsure of himself. I couldn't sleep," Michael said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, gesturing for him to come in. "That's okay. Do you want to talk?" Michael hesitated, then slowly stepped into the room. He glanced around at the shelves lined with books, the framed blueprints on the walls, all remnants of Richard's carefully constructed life. "Did you build all this?" Michael asked, nodding toward the blueprints. "The buildings in the city?" Richard smiled faintly, remembering the pride he had once felt for his work. "Yeah, I helped build a lot of them. It's what I do." Michael nodded, walking over to one of the framed sketches. He studied it for a moment before speaking again. "Do you like it?" The question caught Richard off guard. No one had asked him that in years. "I used to," he admitted. "It gave me something to focus on, something to build. But now, I don't know. It doesn't feel as important as it used to." Michael turned, his eyes curious. "What does?" Richard hesitated, the answer surprising him even as he said it. You and your mom." Michael's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders tensing. "I don't understand any of this," he muttered. "Everything's so messed up. I don't even know what to think anymore." Richard stood up, crossing the room to stand next to him. "I know," he said softly. "None of this is fair. And I wish I could have been there from the start. But I'm here now, Michael. I'm not going anywhere." Michael looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of something else, hope. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. "I don't know if I can trust you," Michael said quietly. "It's just everything's been a lie. Everything." Richard's heart ached at the boy's words, but he nodded. "I get that. It's going to take time, and that's okay. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I'll be here. Whenever you're ready." Michael was silent for a long moment, then he finally nodded, though his face still showed traces of doubt. "Okay," he whispered. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat, knowing how much weight that small word carried. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. As Michael turned and walked back down the hallway toward his room, Richard stood in the doorway of his study, watching the boy disappear into the shadows of the house. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, how they would navigate the fractured pieces of their lives. But for the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him. A chance, a small glimmer of hope. The days that followed passed in an uneasy routine. Richard spent most of his time at the hospital with Michael, visiting Sarah and checking on her condition. She was recovering, but slowly. Every day she seemed stronger, though her eyes held the weight of all the secrets she had kept hidden. Meanwhile, Michael had begun to settle into Richard's house, though their relationship remained fragile, like a bridge only half built. Richard had made every effort to create some semblance of normalcy. He tried to talk to Michael more, spending quiet moments together in the evenings, asking about his interests, even watching some of Michael's favorite TV shows. But there was still a distance between them, one born of years apart and truths too painful to be easily confronted. Michael was polite, even grateful at times, but Richard could sense the walls the boy had built around himself, walls not unlike the ones Richard had spent years constructing. But it wasn't just the past that loomed over them now. Richard couldn't shake the feeling of something darker brewing, something unresolved. The truth about Sarah's past, about Alejandro, gnawed at him like a festering wound. He hadn't brought it up to Michael, not yet. The boy had enough to deal with. But Richard's gut told him that it wasn't over, that the danger Sarah had run from might still be lurking in the shadows. It was early one morning, before they were set to visit Sarah again, that the first sign of trouble appeared. Richard was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his pulse quicken. "Tony," he quickly answered, his voice low so Michael, who was still upstairs getting ready, wouldn't overhear. "Tony, what did you find?" There was a pause on the other end. Then Tony's gruff voice came through, serious and clipped. "You were right to be worried, Richard. I've been digging into Alejandro, and the guy's no small-time threat. He's tied to a criminal organization in Mexico, some nasty stuff. Drug trade, arms smuggling, and worse." Richard's hand tightened around the phone. "Is he still looking for Sarah?" "Hard to say for sure, but he's not the kind of guy who lets things go. If Sarah ran from him with their kid, well, men like him don't forgive that kind of betrayal easily. And if he finds out she's back on the radar, he could come after her. Or worse, after Michael." A cold chill crept down Richard's spine. The thought of someone like Alejandro coming after his son, it was more than he could stomach. Does he know where she is? Not yet. She's been smart, kept a low profile. But there's chatter, people looking for someone that fits Sarah's description. It's not good, Richard. You need to be careful. Richard's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He had to protect them, both Sarah and Michael, but how? How could he fight against a man with dangerous connections and the resources to find them? "Thanks, Tony," Richard said, his voice tight. "Keep digging. Let me know if you hear anything else." As he hung up, he felt a sense of dread settling in his chest. He had never been one to panic, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong or a corporate rival trying to undercut him. This was real danger, life or death. He couldn't afford to be careless, not with Michael's life on the line. Later that day, as they were leaving the hospital after another visit with Sarah, Richard felt the first ripple of something wrong. They were walking toward the parking garage, Michael trailing just a step behind, when Richard noticed a man standing near the entrance. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses. He was leaning against a car, seemingly casual, but his eyes were locked on them. Richard's instincts immediately went on high alert. "Michael," Richard said softly, keeping his voice steady. "Stay close to me, all right?" Michael glanced up, confused, but he nodded, moving closer as they neared the car. Richard didn't look directly at the man, but he could feel the weight of his stare. Something about him felt off, dangerous. Richard's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. The last thing he wanted was to scare Michael or draw attention. As they reached the car, Richard unlocked it quickly, ushering Michael inside. He glanced around the parking lot as casually as possible, but the man was still there, his eyes now hidden behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. Richard got into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He pulled out of the lot smoothly, trying not to appear rushed, but his mind was racing. Had Alejandro found them already? Or was this just paranoia? As they drove away from the hospital, Richard's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He glanced at Michael, who seemed unaware of the tension, his gaze fixed on the window as the city passed by. Richard's mind, however, was working overtime. If Alejandro was closing in, they were running out of time. He needed to be proactive, not just reactive. That evening, after Michael had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study, staring out the window at the sprawling city lights. His thoughts were still on the man at the hospital, on Tony's warning. He knew he couldn't wait for Alejandro to make a move. He had to stay ahead of him. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed Tony's number again. "Tony, I need a favor," Richard said when Tony answered. "I need security, round the clock, discreet. Someone I can trust." Tony didn't hesitate. "I know some guys. They'll keep a low profile, but they won't let anything slip past them." "Good. And Tony, find out everything you can about Alejandro's movements. If he's coming for them, I need to know before he gets anywhere near Michael or Sarah." "Got it. I'll have my team on it." Richard hung up, his mind still buzzing with the weight of everything. He had dealt with threats before, powerful people in the business world, but this was different. This wasn't about money or corporate power plays. This was about his family, about protecting them from a man capable of real harm. The next morning, Richard woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was early, barely dawn, and the house was still quiet. He groggily reached for his phone, half expecting a call from Tony, but instead, The name on the screen made his blood run cold. It was the hospital. "Mr. Harlow." A nurse's voice came through the line, urgent but calm. "There's been an incident. Your ex-wife, Sarah, had a visitor last night. A man. He was seen leaving the building right before we found her room in disarray. She's missing." Richard shot up in bed, his heart pounding. "What do you mean she's missing? Was anyone hurt?" "We don't know yet, but it looks like she may have left under duress. There's no sign of her, and we're reviewing the security footage now. You should come down as soon as possible." The call ended, and Richard sat there, the world spinning around him. Sarah was gone, and there was only one person who could have taken her, Alejandro. His heart hammered in his chest as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. Michael's mother was gone, and the man she had been running from had found her. Richard threw the covers back and rushed out of bed, already dialing Tony's number. He wasn't just up against time anymore. He was up against a man who had been hunting them for years. And now, he had Sarah. "Tony," Richard barked into the phone, "Alejandro's taken Sarah. I need you to find her now." "On it," Tony replied without hesitation. Richard's mind raced as he hurried down the hallway. He stopped outside Michael's room, standing there for a moment, staring at the door. He couldn't tell him yet, not until he knew more. But inside, the fear and anger were building. He had failed to protect her, and now Michael was all that was left. He pushed down the rising panic and steeled himself. Alejandro had taken Sarah, but Richard wasn't going to let him take Michael too. Richard had never driven so fast in his life. The early morning streets of Los Angeles blurred as he sped toward the hospital, the city still waking up as the sun barely crept over the horizon. His heart raced in his chest, every beat echoing with the fear that Alejandro had already gotten too far. The words from the nurse echoed in his mind. "Sarah's missing." It felt unreal, like a nightmare playing out in slow motion. By the time he pulled into the hospital parking lot, his mind was spinning with questions. Why had Sarah gone with Alejandro? Was she forced? Did she think she could protect Michael by disappearing again? Nothing made sense, and the uncertainty gnawed at him as he raced toward the entrance. Inside, the hospital was eerily quiet for such a chaotic morning. Richard rushed past the front desk, barely acknowledging the nurse who had called him. The elevator felt agonizingly slow as it ascended to the floor where Sarah's room had been. When the doors finally slid open, a small team of hospital security officers was gathered near her door, their faces grim. One of the security guards approached him, recognizing Richard from his frequent visits. "Mr. Harlow, I'm sorry, but we've reviewed the footage. It's not good." Richard's jaw clenched. "What happened?" The guard motioned toward a small security office just down the hall. "Come with me." They entered the cramped room where a monitor displayed grainy black and white footage from the hospital security cameras. The guard rewound the video to the previous night. The image was faint, but Richard could clearly make out a tall man entering Sarah's room around midnight. His face was obscured by a hood, but his build was unmistakably strong, intimidating. The man lingered in the room for several minutes, and though there was no sound, Richard could imagine the tension that had filled the air. He could feel it in his bones. "That's him," Richard muttered, his voice tight. "Alejandro." The guard nodded grimly. It looks like they had a conversation. He wasn't in a rush to leave. But then something changed. He forced her out of the bed, and the two of them walked out through the side exit. She didn't put up much of a fight, but from her body language, it looks like she didn't have much choice. Richard's stomach twisted. Sarah had gone with Alejandro, likely to protect Michael. But the image of her being let out, weak and vulnerable, sent a surge of anger through him. Did anyone see them leave? Was anyone hurt? Richard asked, his voice sharp. The guard shook his head. No one was harmed, and they were gone before we even knew what had happened. We're working with the police now, but there's no trace of them. Richard stared at the screen, watching as Alejandro's shadowy figure led Sarah away. A rage he hadn't felt in years boiled up inside him. This man had taken the woman he once loved, the mother of his son, and had turned her life into a nightmare. Now he had dragged her back into that darkness. Richard could only guess at what Alejandro wanted. Revenge? Control? It didn't matter. He had crossed a line, and Richard wasn't going to let him destroy what was left of their lives. "Do you have any leads on where they went?" Richard asked, his mind racing. "We're still reviewing the footage from the exterior cameras, but so far, no luck," the guard replied. Richard cursed under his breath. He needed to move faster. "Think, Richard." He paced the small room, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Alejandro wouldn't be reckless enough to take Sarah somewhere obvious. He would hide her, use her as leverage, and if Richard didn't act quickly, Alejandro could vanish just as easily as he had found them. Richard grabbed his phone and called Tony. He could hear the tension in Tony's voice as he answered. "Anything yet?" Richard asked, his tone urgent. "Not much, but we're close," Tony replied. "I've got some guys on the ground looking into Alejandro's last known associates. He's a ghost, but even ghosts leave footprints if you know where to look. I'll have something concrete soon." "Make it quick," Richard said, his voice tight. "He's already got Sarah." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Damn, that complicates things. But don't worry, we'll find her. Just keep a low profile for now. If Alejandro's after something, he might make a move." Richard hung up, his mind already thinking ahead. He couldn't wait around for answers. Michael was still at home, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond their front door. He needed to secure the house, ensure Michael's safety before confronting Alejandro. The thought of losing his son to this madman was unbearable. When Richard returned home later that morning, the house felt eerily still. Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly picking at a bowl of cereal. He looked up as Richard walked in, his face filled with confusion. "What happened? Why did you leave so early?" Richard hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He couldn't lie to Michael, not anymore. But how could he explain this without terrifying him? He needed to keep Michael calm, but he also needed him to understand the gravity of the situation. "Michael," Richard said carefully, sitting down across from him, "we need to talk." Michael's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Your mom. Something happened at the hospital last night. She's gone. Someone took her." Michael's eyes widened, his spoon clattering into the bowl. "What do you mean, someone took her?" "Who?" "A man named Alejandro," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He's someone from your mother's past. She was trying to keep you safe from him all these years, but he found her." Michael's face went pale, his body going rigid. "Why didn't she tell me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Richard reached across the table, placing a hand on Michael's arm. "She was trying to protect you. She didn't want you to get hurt. But now she's gone," Michael said, his voice breaking. "Is she going to come back? Is he going to hurt her?" Richard's heart clenched. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to find her. And I won't let anything happen to you, Michael. You're safe here." Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, trying to hold himself together. "What if he comes after me?" "He won't," Richard said firmly. "I've already got people making sure of that. No one's going to hurt you. Not while I'm here." But even as he said the words, Richard couldn't shake the fear gnawing at him. Alejandro had already found Sarah, and if he was desperate enough, there was no telling what he might do next. Richard knew he had to act fast. He couldn't afford to wait for the authorities. He had to confront Alejandro himself. That evening, Richard stood on the balcony of his estate, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was Tony. "I've got a lead," Tony said, his voice low and urgent. "Alejandro's been spotted at a warehouse near the docks. It's one of his old haunts. Lots of activity going in and out. It's not confirmed, but it's your best shot." Richard felt a surge of adrenaline. "I'm going there." "Wait," Tony started, but Richard cut him off. "No more waiting, Tony. I'm done sitting around while he's got Sarah. I'm going to end this." "Fine," Tony said with a sigh. "But be careful. This guy doesn't play by the rules. I'll send backup, but you'll be on your own for a bit. Don't do anything stupid." Richard ended the call, his mind focused, his pulse racing. This was it. He had no choice but to confront Alejandro head-on. He wouldn't let this man destroy his family, not again. Before leaving, Richard checked on Michael, who was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I'm going out for a bit," Richard said gently. "I won't be long." Michael looked at him, his eyes filled with worry. "You're going after him, aren't you?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. "I have to, but don't worry. I'll be back." Michael didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was scared. Scared of losing his mother. Scared of losing Richard, too. "I'll be back," Richard repeated, trying to sound confident. "I promise." And with that, he turned and left the house, his mind set on one thing: bringing Sarah home and ending Alejandro's threat once and for all. Richard drove through the city with an intensity that made every moment feel like a countdown. The orange glow of the setting sun had faded, replaced by the cold gleam of streetlights as the shadows of Los Angeles stretched into the night. The address Tony had given him echoed in his mind. An old warehouse near the docks, one of Alejandro's last known hideouts. Richard knew that this was it, the showdown he had been dreading and preparing for all at once. His mind raced with images of Sarah, scared, vulnerable, trapped with the man who had haunted her life for years. Every second wasted was a second too long. Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched with determination. He had spent years building an empire, navigating ruthless business deals, but this was different. This wasn't about money or power. It was about his family. He had lost too much already. He wouldn't lose Sarah again, and he wouldn't let Michael live in fear of a man who thrived on control. As he pulled up to the edge of the docks, the air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a hulking, abandoned structure that looked as lifeless as the surrounding area. It was dark and eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of ships in the harbor providing any sound. Richard parked his car a few blocks away, slipping out quietly to avoid drawing attention. He had no idea what waited for him inside, but he couldn't afford hesitation. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the warehouse, staying low as he moved through the shadows. Tony had warned him that Alejandro wasn't someone to be underestimated. Richard had seen men like Alejandro before. Ruthless, calculating, always a step ahead. But Richard had something Alejandro didn't: desperation. And tonight, that desperation was driving him forward. The warehouse door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping inside with caution. The interior was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering sporadically, casting long shadows across the empty space. The building was mostly silent, but Richard could hear the faint echo of voices from deeper inside. He moved carefully, sticking close to the walls as he followed the sound. He reached a narrow corridor that led to a larger room at the center of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Richard could see them. Sarah, seated in a chair, her wrists bound, her face pale but defiant. Across from her stood Alejandro, a tall, imposing figure whose presence filled the room with a menacing air. His voice was low and threatening, though Richard couldn't make out the words. Richard's blood boiled at the sight. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to rush in and tear Alejandro away from her. But he knew he had to be smart. Charging in blindly wouldn't help Sarah. It would only get them both killed. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he formulated a plan. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah's voice reached him, strained but filled with anger. "Haven't you done enough? I left you years ago, Alejandro. You can't control me anymore." Alejandro chuckled, his tone cold and condescending. "You think you're free, Sarah? After everything you took from me? You ran, took my son, and now you think I'll just let you walk away? You owe me." Sarah's eyes flashed with defiance. "He was never yours. Michael was never your son." Alejandro's face twisted with rage, and he grabbed her by the chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I made you, Sarah. Everything you are, you owe to me. And if you think I'll let you and that kid disappear again, you're wrong." That was it. Richard couldn't stand by any longer. The sight of Alejandro laying a hand on Sarah was enough to make his blood boil over. Without another thought, Richard burst into the room, his voice booming. "Let her go, Alejandro." Alejandro turned, startled by Richard's sudden appearance. His eyes narrowed, recognizing him immediately. "Richard Harlow," he sneered. "I wondered when you'd show up." Richard stepped forward, his posture rigid, his voice filled with icy determination. "This ends tonight. You're not taking Sarah, and you're not getting anywhere near Michael." Alejandro smirked, though there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with, Harlow." "Maybe not," Richard replied, his eyes fixed on Alejandro. "But I know exactly who you are. A coward. A man who hides behind threats and violence because he's too weak to stand on his own." The insult struck a nerve. Alejandro's smirk faded, replaced by a simmering anger. "You don't know anything about me, but you will. You'll see what happens when you try to take what's mine." Alejandro reached for a gun tucked into his waistband, but Richard was faster. Without hesitation, Richard lunged forward, knocking the weapon from Alejandro's hand. The gun clattered to the floor, skidding out of reach, and the two men collided with a force that sent them both crashing into the nearby table. The room erupted into chaos. Richard and Alejandro grappled, each trying to gain the upper hand. Alejandro was strong, his years of violence giving him an edge in close combat, but Richard fought with a fury born of desperation. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Sarah, for Michael, for the life they deserved to have free from fear. The two men exchanged blows, each hit sending shockwaves of pain through Richard's body. But he didn't let up. He couldn't. With a surge of adrenaline, he managed to shove Alejandro hard against the wall, pinning him there. "You're done," Richard growled, his voice low and filled with menace. Alejandro glared at him, but the arrogance in his eyes had faded, replaced by something more primal, fear. He struggled against Richard's grip, but it was no use. Richard had him, and he wasn't letting go. Suddenly, there was a shout from behind them. Tony's team had arrived. Two large men in tactical gear burst into the room, guns drawn. They quickly subdued Alejandro, pulling him away from Richard and forcing him to the ground, securing him with zip ties. "It's over, Alejandro," one of the men said firmly, holding him in place. Richard staggered back, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. He wiped the blood from his lip and turned to Sarah, who was still sitting in the chair, her eyes wide with shock but otherwise unharmed. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, rushing over to her. Sarah nodded, her voice shaky. "I'm fine. Thanks to you." Richard quickly untied her hands, helping her stand. She was weak, but she leaned against him, steadying herself. For a moment, they just stood there, the chaos of the room fading into the background. Alejandro was being dragged away, shouting curses, but Richard didn't hear any of it. All that mattered was that Sarah was safe. Later that night, back at Richard's estate, the house was quiet. Michael had been anxiously waiting for them to return, and when Sarah walked through the door, the relief in his eyes was palpable. He rushed into her arms, burying his face against her as she held him close, whispering reassurances that she was okay. Richard stood nearby, watching the reunion with a sense of overwhelming emotion. The storm had passed, and they were together. Finally, Sarah looked up at Richard, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything," Richard nodded. But he knew that this wasn't about thanks. It was about something deeper, something they had both fought for. Family, safety, a future. That night, after Michael had gone to bed, Richard and Sarah sat together in the quiet of the living room. The weight of the day still hung over them, but there was also a sense of peace. They had faced the worst, and they had survived. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. "For everything. For keeping Michael from you. For running." Richard looked at her, his heart heavy but understanding. "I know why you did it. You were protecting him. I just wish you had told me sooner." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was scared. I thought if I stayed, if I let you back in, Alejandro would find us. And I couldn't lose Michael." Richard reached over, taking her hand. "You don't have to run anymore. It's over." Sarah squeezed his hand, her gaze filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I know, but I'm not sure where we go from here." "We'll figure it out," Richard said, his voice steady. Together. For the first time in years, Sarah smiled. A real, genuine smile. And in that moment, Richard knew that they had a chance. It wouldn't be easy, but they had survived the worst. And now, with Alejandro behind them, they could finally begin to rebuild.